Quiet lakes, frozen forests, and fog-bound roads have become stages for people brushing against something immense. From a canoe trip on a lake that ends with a boat adrift and two people crushed by an unseen force to a late-night Virginia drive where a man hits something in fog, leaving his grill buckled and giant footprints behind. In this video, we'll explore 6 disturbing stories of people who came too close to whatever is out there. On November 30th, 2025, Mark Aldrin and his wife Jenna decided to take their loyal Labrador mix, Buddy, out for what they believed would be a peaceful autumn paddle across one of northern Canada's most isolated lakes. The region, located roughly 200 kilometers northeast of Whitehorse, had long been known for its unforgiving wilderness and the eerie stillness that blanketed its waters during the colder months. The lake itself stretched nearly 4 miles across, bordered by dense conifer forests and jagged granite cliffs that rose like ancient sentinels from the earth. Local trappers and fishermen rarely ventured there anymore, not because of any official restrictions, but because of whispered stories passed down through generations about something that watched from the tree line. Mark, a retired forestry technician, had always dismissed such tales as nonsense meant to scare tourists. Jenna, a high school mathematics teacher, shared his skepticism. They had paddled this very lake 3 times before without incident, always marveling at how the water reflected the sky so perfectly that it felt like gliding through open air. Their dog Buddy, a 7-year-old rescue with a patchy brown and white coat, had become an enthusiastic companion on these trips, always perched at the bow with his nose twitching at every scent carried by the breeze. The morning of November 30th arrived cold and clear. Mark and Jenna loaded their red canoe onto their truck before dawn, packing sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, and a wool blanket for Buddy. They reached the lake's southern launch point just after sunrise, the water glassy and undisturbed. A local fisherman named Gord Mickelson happened to be rigging his lines nearby and exchanged brief pleasantries with the couple. He later told investigators that Mark had joked about finally getting some decent photographs of the cliffs at this time of year, while Jenna mentioned they would be back by early afternoon, since the temperature was supposed to drop. Gord waved as they pushed off from shore around 8:30 in the morning, watching their canoe grow smaller until it became just a red speck against the vastness of the lake. By noon, the Aldrins had not returned to the launch point. Gord, who had been keeping a casual eye on the lake between checking his traps, grew mildly concerned, but figured they had simply decided to explore the northern shoreline more thoroughly. However, when 3 o'clock arrived and shadows began stretching long across the water, he felt genuine unease. He tried calling Mark's cell phone, which went straight to voicemail. The closest ranger station was contacted, and by 4:30 a small motorboat with 2 volunteer search members began scanning the lake. The searchers found the canoe just before dusk, drifting in the center of the lake approximately 2 miles from the launch point. What struck them immediately was how stable it appeared, sitting perfectly level in the water with no signs of capsizing or struggle. The paddles were stowed neatly across the thwart, positioned as though someone had deliberately placed them there during a lunch break. As the rescue boat approached and one of the volunteers shone a flashlight into the canoe, what he saw made him grab the radio with shaking hands. Mark and Jenna were inside the canoe, both deceased. Their bodies were positioned back to back in the hull, almost as if they had been arranged that way intentionally. Mark's neck showed severe crushing injuries, twisted at an angle that suggested enormous force applied from above. Jenna's injuries were similar, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. What disturbed the rescuers most was the peaceful expression on both their faces, as though death had arrived so swiftly they had not even registered fear. Buddy was found alive, curled tightly at their feet, trembling violently but physically unharmed. His collar tag caught the flashlight beam, still wet despite the canoe's interior being completely dry. There was no water in the boat at all, ruling out any capsizing scenario. The hull showed shallow scratch marks along the exterior, deep gouges in the wood that seemed to pull outward rather than inward, as though something had gripped the canoe from outside and dragged its claws along the surface. Forensic investigators later determined the marks were inconsistent with any known animal in the region, far too large for bear claws, and spaced too widely to match wolverine or lynx. The following morning, conservation officers and Royal Canadian Mounted Police conducted a thorough examination of the launch area. What they discovered in the mud near the water's edge defied easy explanation. Enormous footprints, measuring 19 inches in length with toes splayed unusually broad, circled the launch point in a pattern that suggested something had paced back and forth before entering the water. The prints were deep, indicating significant weight, and showed clear dermal ridges that ruled out any hoax or manufactured impression. Most puzzling was how the track simply stopped at the water's edge, with no corresponding exit prints anywhere along the shoreline. Whatever had made those tracks had apparently waded into the lake and never returned to shore, at least not at any point the investigators examined. Gord Mickelson, when interviewed again, recalled hearing strange sounds that day around late morning. He described hearing what sounded like heavy splashes coming from the middle of the lake, as though something large had dropped from a height into the water. He also mentioned a deep, resonant bark that echoed off the cliffs, which he had initially assumed was Buddy, but later realized sounded nothing like any dog he had ever heard. The sound had been lower, more guttural, and seemed to carry across the water with unnatural clarity. The Aldrin's life jackets were discovered stacked in a neat pyramid on the dock, their straps looped together in a manner that Jenna's sister later confirmed was not how the couple typically stored them. The arrangement suggested someone or something had handled them after the Aldrins had left. Local residents, upon hearing the details, were not surprised. The lake had earned a dark reputation over the decades, with fishermen reporting unexplained ripples moving against the wind and glimpses of large shapes moving beneath the surface in water too shallow for any known fish species. Some claim to have seen massive silhouettes standing motionless on distant shores, watching boats pass by with an intelligence that felt distinctly non-animal. The case was officially closed as deaths by unknown causes, though the phrase felt hollow to everyone involved. Mark and Jenna Aldrin were buried in a joint ceremony 3 weeks later. Buddy was adopted by Jenna's sister, though the dog never fully recovered, spending the rest of his days refusing to go near any body of water. The red canoe was impounded as evidence, then eventually released to the family who chose to have it destroyed. The lake remains open to the public, but boats rarely venture onto its surface anymore. On calm days, its mirror-like waters reflect only empty sky, as though whatever secrets it holds have been pulled deep beneath where light cannot follow. On September 12, 2024, Vic Harlan was completing what should have been a routine supply run over the Yukon Territory's seemingly endless taiga. The 43-year-old helicopter pilot had logged over 15 years flying cargo across Canada's most remote regions, ferrying equipment and provisions to mining camps that existed as tiny human outposts in an otherwise untamed wilderness. The particular stretch of territory he covered that day lay approximately 300 kilometers northwest of Dawson City, where boreal forests stretched unbroken to every horizon, and human presence was measured in single digits per 1,000 square kilometers. Vic's helicopter cut through morning fog at 2,000 feet, its rotors chopping rhythmically as he followed a familiar route toward a copper mining operation. The mining camp, established only 18 months prior, relied entirely on air delivery for supplies, since winter road access remained impossible for 8 months of the year. Vic carried the usual cargo that morning: diesel fuel containers, replacement drill bits, medical supplies, and several boxes of food staples. His radio crackled occasionally with static, typical for the region where communication towers were sparse and atmospheric interference common. The flight had been unremarkable until approximately 20 minutes from his destination. Vic was maintaining steady altitude when his radio suddenly erupted with harsh static that made him wince and adjust his headset. Before he could troubleshoot the interference, a heavy thud reverberated through the helicopter's frame, shaking the skids beneath him as though something substantial had struck or landed on the aircraft. His instruments showed no mechanical failure, no loss of altitude, nothing that explained the impact he had clearly felt through his seat. Vic immediately banked hard to the right, scanning below for any possible explanation. What he saw made him pull the cyclic even harder, bringing the helicopter into a tight circle. Below him, moving across a frozen creek bed with shocking speed, was a massive figure. It stood far taller than the surrounding pine trees, which Vic estimated at roughly 20 feet in that particular stand. The creature moved on two legs with a loping, powerful gait, its arms swinging loose at its sides in a motion that seemed almost casual despite the speed it maintained. As Vic descended to 1,500 feet for a better view, the figure's head turned upward, tracking the helicopter's movement with what appeared to be deliberate focus. Against every instinct screaming at him to gain altitude and leave, Vic circled lower, dropping to just over 1,000 feet. His landing lights illuminated the snow below, catching fresh tracks that cut a clear path through the pristine white surface. The footprints measured enormous, easily 20 inches in length, with toes splayed outward in a distinctly primate-like configuration. What struck Vic most was the steam rising from each print, indicating they had been made mere moments before, still carrying heat from whatever had made them. The figure paused at the tree line, its massive frame silhouetted against the snow. Then, in a gesture that would haunt Vic for months afterward, it raised one arm skyward in what appeared unmistakably like a wave or acknowledgement. The movement was not threatening, but rather seemed almost communicative, as though the creature recognized the helicopter as containing another conscious being. Vic hovered for perhaps 10 seconds longer, his thumb frozen over the camera button on his control panel, before the figure turned and vanished into a thick stand of willows with surprising grace for something of its size. Vic completed his delivery run in a daze, landing at the mining camp and mechanically unloading his cargo. The camp supervisor, a man named Dale Pritchard, later told investigators that Vic had seemed shaken and distracted, mentioning only that he had seen something unusual during the flight. When Dale examined the delivered supplies, he found them exactly as manifested, but the securing ropes were coiled in loops far too large for human hands, with a diameter suggesting fingers of considerable thickness. Back at his base in Whitehorse 3 days later, Vic filed an incident report that carefully avoided specific conclusions. He described only what he had observed: the unexplained impact, the figure below, the impossible tracks. His helicopter underwent a thorough mechanical inspection, but showed no damage or malfunction. However, Vic refused to fly that particular route for the next 6 weeks, citing equipment concerns that his employer found puzzling given the clean inspection report. Other pilots who covered his routes during that period reported nothing unusual, though 2 mentioned seeing ravens behaving strangely near the frozen creek area, circling in patterns that seemed to avoid one particular section of forest. The mining camp received its supplies without incident, but Dale Pritchard noted in his personal journal that several camp workers had reported hearing heavy footsteps circling the perimeter at night, accompanied by deep breathing that seemed to come from something far larger than any known wildlife. Vic eventually returned to flying the route, though he maintained a minimum altitude of 3,000 feet and avoided unnecessary descents. He installed additional recording equipment in his helicopter, though he never captured anything definitive. On quiet flights, when the only sound was the steady rhythm of rotor blades, Vic sometimes thought about that raised arm and what it might have meant. The skies over the Yukon felt more crowded now, shadows clinging to his altimeter even on the clearest days. On August 17, 2023, brothers Jed Hollister and Roy Hollister descended into an abandoned mine shaft in northern Idaho's Coeur d'Alene mining district, hoping to find overlooked gold deposits that 19th century miners might have missed. The region, located roughly 40 miles east of the town of Wallace, had been extensively mined during the 1880s silver and gold rush, leaving behind a honeycomb network of tunnels that burrowed deep into the mountainside. Most of these old workings had been sealed or condemned decades ago, but a few remained accessible to those willing to ignore faded warning signs and rusted chain-link barriers. Jed, 31, worked as a heavy equipment operator, while his younger brother Roy, 27, made his living as a welder. Neither had formal mining experience, but both had grown up hearing stories from their grandfather about the fortunes supposedly left behind when mining operations shut down. They had explored several abandoned sites over the past 2 years, finding nothing more valuable than rusted tools and rotted timber supports. But their optimism never wavered. The particular shaft they chose that August morning had been part of a small independent operation that closed in 1947 after a minor collapse killed 2 workers. Local records showed the mine had produced modest amounts of gold before its closure, enough to keep the brothers interested. They entered the main shaft at approximately 9 in the morning, their headlamps cutting bright cones through dust that hung suspended in the still air. The tunnel descended at a gentle angle for the first 100 feet before leveling out into a larger chamber, where ore carts had once been loaded. The temperature dropped noticeably as they moved deeper, and the air carried that peculiar mineral smell common to old mines, a mixture of damp stone and oxidized metal. Timber supports, though aged and cracked, still held the ceiling in place, though both brothers moved carefully, aware that structural integrity was never guaranteed in abandoned workings. About 300 feet from the entrance, they discovered something unexpected. A small alcove, barely visible from the main tunnel, had been carved into the eastern wall. Inside this space sat 2 metal lunchboxes, the old-fashioned kind that workers might have carried in the 1940s. Jed pried open the first box and found sandwich remains inside. The bread dried to something resembling cardboard, but still recognizable. What struck him as odd was that each sandwich had been carefully cut in half, and the crusts had been arranged in a near-perfect circle on the box lid, as though someone had methodically organized them during a meal. Roy examined the second lunchbox and found similar contents, but what caught his attention were the footprints in the damp dirt surrounding the alcove. The floor of the mine retained moisture from groundwater seepage, creating a muddy surface that preserved impressions remarkably well. The prints measured approximately 18 inches in length, far larger than any work boot either brother had ever seen. The toe marks pressed deep into the mud, showing 5 distinct digits with spacing that seemed too wide for human feet. The prints circled the alcove in a pattern suggesting something had paced back and forth multiple times before the mud had dried enough to hold the impressions permanently. More disturbing was the fact that several prints appeared on the tunnel walls themselves, pressed into patches of mud at heights of 4 and 5 feet above the floor, as though whatever made them had been climbing or moving along the walls with ease. Roy traced one print with his finger, noting how the mud had been displaced by significant force, ruling out any possibility of someone simply pressing a carved stamp against the surface. The brothers decided to investigate further, following the prints deeper into the mine. The tunnel narrowed ahead, forcing them to duck beneath sagging timbers. Roy moved ahead with his pickaxe, testing the stability of rocks that protruded from the ceiling. He struck one particularly large formation, and the metallic ring of steel on stone echoed down the passage with unusual intensity. At that moment, Roy simply vanished. Jed later told investigators that 1 second his brother was visible in his headlamp beam, and the next there was only an empty tunnel. The sound of Roy's pickaxe hitting stone seemed to trigger something, a massive displacement of air that Jed described as feeling like standing behind a truck as it accelerated. He heard stones grinding together with tremendous force, as though some enormous weight was pressing through a tight space. Then came a sound that Jed insisted was breathing, deep and rhythmic, coming from somewhere very close in the darkness. Jed shouted Roy's name repeatedly, his voice growing hoarse as panic set in. His headlamp began to dim, the battery draining far faster than it should have given its charge that morning. He stumbled forward, calling out, sweeping his failing light across tunnel walls that seemed to close in around him. The breathing sound continued, neither approaching nor retreating, simply present in a way that suggested patient observation. When Jed's light finally died completely, he ran. He crashed into support timbers, scraped his hands raw on stone walls, and nearly fell twice before he saw the distant gray light of the entrance. He emerged from the mine at approximately 11:15, 2 hours after they had entered, and immediately drove to the nearest ranger station to report Roy missing. The rescue team arrived by early afternoon, equipped with proper lighting and safety gear. They descended carefully, mapping their route as they went. Approximately 400 feet into the mine, in a section where the main tunnel intersected with a smaller drift, They found Roy's helmet wedged in a narrow crack between two large boulders. The lamp was still functioning, its beam pointing upward at an angle that illuminated rough ceiling stone. Despite extensive searching over the next 6 hours, no other trace of Roy Hollister was discovered. The mine was officially sealed 3 weeks later. Heavy concrete barriers installed at the entrance along with warning signs threatening prosecution for trespassing. Jed Hollister gave multiple interviews to local media, but found himself unable to adequately describe what had happened. He mentioned the footprints, the lunchboxes, the breathing sound, but each detail sounded increasingly implausible when spoken aloud. The Coeur d'Alene mining district contains over 3,000 miles of underground tunnels, most unmapped and inaccessible. Roy Hollister's case remained classified as a missing person, presumed dead in a mining accident. The official report made no mention of the footprints or the arranged sandwich crusts. Jed never entered another mine, though he sometimes drove past the sealed entrance, listening for sounds too deep for tools. On February 3, 2025, Lena Hayes decided to venture beyond the marked boundaries of a popular ski resort in California's Sierra Nevada mountain range for some backcountry snowboarding. The 29-year-old graphic designer from Sacramento had been snowboarding since her teenage years and considered herself competent enough to handle unpatrolled terrain. The resort sat at an elevation of 8,000 feet and received over 400 inches of snowfall annually. The previous night had dumped nearly 18 inches of fresh powder across the upper elevations, and Lena woke early to catch the first chairlift. By 8:30, she had completed 2 runs on groomed trails before deciding to hike beyond the resort's boundary fence to access untouched snow on the mountain's northeastern face. This area was marked with warning signs indicating that ski patrol did not monitor the terrain beyond that point. Lena hiked for roughly 20 minutes, her snowboard strapped to her backpack, before reaching a ridgeline that offered a clear run down through widely spaced pine trees. She buckled her boots into the board's bindings, adjusting the straps until they felt secure, then pushed off down the slope with long, sweeping turns that sent powder spraying in crystalline arcs. The sensation of riding through untouched snow was exactly what Lena had hoped for, each turn smooth and controlled. She was perhaps 300 vertical feet into her run when she noticed something odd. Her boot straps, which she had tightened carefully at the top, now hung loose against her ankles. The buckles were completely undone, as though someone had reached down and released them while she was moving. Lena skidded to a stop, planting her board edge into the snow. She crouched down to examine the bindings, confused about how they could have come loose. The buckle mechanisms showed no signs of mechanical failure. As she refastened them, she noticed tracks in the snow that had not been there moments before. Enormous footprints, measuring approximately 18 inches in length with toes splayed deep into the powder, crossed directly over her fresh boarding tracks. The prints ran parallel to her descent line, before angling uphill in a pattern that suggested something had climbed the steep slope with remarkable speed. What disturbed Lena most was the spacing between prints, indicating a stride length far exceeding human capability, and the depth of each impression, showing that whatever made them carried substantial weight. She stood up slowly, scanning the tree line above her. Nothing moved except wind-disturbed snow falling from pine branches. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by her own breathing, and the distant sound of chairlift machinery from the resort far below. Lena decided immediately that continuing down was wiser than hiking back up, so she pointed her board downslope and pushed off with more speed than caution. She had covered perhaps another 100 feet when she felt a strange bunching of snow beneath her board, as though an extra layer of powder had suddenly materialized under her path. The sensation created drag that should not have existed on a slope this steep. Lena leaned forward, trying to maintain momentum when she hit a small natural jump formed by a buried log. She was airborne for perhaps 2 seconds, long enough to rotate her head and look back upslope. What she saw launched ice through her veins. A massive dark shape was emerging from a cluster of pine trees roughly 50 yards above her. It had fur, thick and dark brown, covering a frame that moved on 2 legs with shocking coordination. Its arms swung wide for balance as it began descending the slope at an angle that would intersect with her trajectory. Lena landed hard, her knees absorbing the impact, and immediately carved a sharp turn toward a denser section of trees to her left. She could hear something moving behind her, snow crunching with a rhythm that matched her own turns. The sound was too close, keeping pace despite her increased speed. She risked another glance back and saw it clearly now, perhaps 30 yards behind, running on two legs with a loping gait that covered ground with disturbing efficiency. Its face remained shadowed, but its sheer size was undeniable, standing well over 7 feet tall with shoulders broader than any human she had ever seen. Lena aimed for the thickest part of the tree cluster, hoping the tight spacing would slow whatever was pursuing her. She threaded between two pines with barely inches to spare, then immediately cut hard right. Her board edge caught on a buried rock and the impact sent her tumbling forward. She crashed into a small pine tree, the collision snapping her snowboard cleanly in half at the binding mounting point. The broken halves clattered down the slope while Lena scrambled behind the tree trunk, pressing her back against the bark. She heard heavy footfalls approaching, then stopping. The breathing sound continued, deep and measured, coming from somewhere just beyond her visual range. Lena remained frozen, her hands pressed against rough bark, eyes scanning for any movement. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The breathing gradually faded, replaced by the sound of something moving uphill through deep snow, branches snapping as the unseen presence retreated. Lena waited another 10 minutes before she dared move. She unstrapped her boots from the broken board segments and began hiking down the mountain on foot, post-holing through powder that reached her thighs. The hike took nearly 2 hours, and by the time she reached the resort boundary, her legs were trembling from exhaustion and an adrenaline crash. Ski patrol found her stumbling through trees near the base area around noon. She was hypothermic and borderline hysterical, talking rapidly about something chasing her. They wrapped her in emergency blankets and took her to the resort's medical clinic, where she was treated for minor scrapes and mild frostbite. When ski patrol investigated the following day, they found her broken snowboard scattered across the slope exactly where she had described. They also found tracks, dozens of them, mixing with her boarding trail all the way down from the ridgeline. The prints were photographed but never officially explained. Resort management declined to comment publicly, stating only that guests were reminded to stay within marked boundaries. Lena Hayes recovered physically within a week, but never returned to backcountry riding. She sold all her snowboarding equipment 2 months later and took up rock climbing instead, preferring vertical stone faces where she could see threats approaching from any direction. She still visited the mountains occasionally, but only on groomed runs with clear sight lines, and she found herself constantly checking shadows in every open space, unable to shake the memory of something that kept pace with her descent. On December 1st, 2020, the Petrov family embarked on what they intended to be a week-long winter camping trip deep into Siberia's remote taiga region. Viktor Petrov, a 47-year-old civil engineer from Irkutsk, had purchased a used recreational vehicle the previous summer to explore the vast wilderness east of Lake Baikal. His wife, Olga, a 42-year-old pharmacist, shared his enthusiasm for outdoor adventures, and their 2 children, 14-year-old Anya and 8-year-old Sasha, had been excited about the trip for months. The family planned to follow old logging roads through largely uninhabited forest before returning home in time for Sasha's school performance on December 8th. The region they chose lay approximately 230 kilometers northeast of Irkutsk, where the taiga stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles. The landscape consisted of larch, pine, and birch forests interspersed with frozen streams and occasional clearings. Human presence was minimal, limited mainly to a few hunting cabins and abandoned Soviet-era logging camps. Winter temperatures regularly dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The Petrovs departed Irkutsk that morning, their RV loaded with food supplies, warm clothing, extra fuel, and emergency equipment. Viktor had meticulously planned their route, marking waypoints on topographic maps and ensuring they carried satellite communication devices. They traveled through the day, and spent their first night near an abandoned forestry station roughly 100 kilometers from the city. The next day, they continued deeper into the wilderness, following a deteriorating dirt road through increasingly dense forest. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing beside a frozen stream where Victor decided to park. The family spent the evening playing cards inside the RV while the diesel heater hummed softly, maintaining warmth despite the brutal cold outside. A hunter named Dmitry Volkov, who maintained a cabin approximately 15 kilometers south, later told investigators that he had noticed the Petrovs' RV parked in the clearing when he passed through the following morning around mid-morning. The vehicle appeared normal, with no obvious signs of distress, though he did not stop as he was tracking elk. When the Petrovs failed to return by December 9th, and when Victor's employer reported him missing after he failed to appear for work on December 10th, authorities initiated a search. Using the waypoints Victor had filed with local rangers, search teams located the RV on December 12th, still parked in the clearing beside the frozen stream. What they found defied straightforward explanation. The RV sat undisturbed in the snow, its engine cold but showing no signs of mechanical failure. The door hung open, swaying in the wind, but the keys remained in the ignition turned to the off position, suggesting someone had deliberately shut down the vehicle rather than abandoning it in panic. Inside, the living space was meticulously organized. The bunks were made with blankets folded precisely at the foot of each bed. 4 winter coats were folded on the dashboard, stacked by size from largest to smallest. The heater was off, and the interior temperature matched the outside air at roughly minus 25 degrees. The family had vanished completely. No footprints led away from the RV except for enormous tracks that circled the vehicle in the fresh snow. These prints measured approximately 20 inches in length, with toes splayed unusually wide, pressed deep into powder that had fallen during the early morning hours that day. The tracks circled the RV multiple times, approaching from the forest to the north and leading back into dense pines without any corresponding return path visible in the clearing. Most puzzling was the arrangement of items outside the vehicle. The family's groceries, which had been stored inside the RV, were stacked in a careful pyramid on the hood. Canned goods were organized by size, with larger items at the base progressing to smaller cans at the apex. Fresh food items like bread and fruit had been placed in a separate pile nearby, protected from snow by a tarp draped over them with unexpected care. The RV's exterior showed light scratches on the doorframe, shallow marks that seemed to pull inward rather than outward, as though something had gripped the door from outside and pulled it open rather than forcing entry. The scratches were inconsistent with tool marks or animal claws from any species known to inhabit the region. Search teams combed the surrounding forest for 3 weeks, expanding their radius to over 50 square kilometers. Heavy snowfall during the second week of December complicated efforts, covering any tracks or evidence that might have existed. On December 18th, one search team member discovered Sasha's toy bear perched upright on a tree stump approximately 2 kilometers northeast of the RV site. The stuffed animal, a worn brown bear that Olga later confirmed was Sasha's favorite possession, sat positioned as though deliberately placed, its button eyes facing back toward the clearing. The stump showed no footprints approaching or leaving, the surrounding snow pristine and undisturbed. No trace of Victor, Olga, Anya, or Sasha Petrov was ever recovered. The case remained officially open as missing persons, though investigators privately acknowledged they had no viable lead. The RV was eventually transported back to Irkutsk and released to Victor's brother, who reported that nothing appeared missing except for the family's personal identification documents. Dmitry Volkov was interviewed multiple times. During his third interview, he mentioned something he had initially dismissed as unimportant. On the evening of their first full day in the forest, while at his cabin, he had heard unusual sounds carried on the wind from the north. He described deep, resonant calls that reminded him of moose vocalizations, but lower in pitch and more measured in rhythm, as though attempting communication rather than simple animal utterance. He had heard similar sounds on one other occasion years earlier, and had learned from older hunters to stay inside when such calls echoed through the forest. Local indigenous groups, when consulted informally by journalists covering the case, were unsurprising in their lack of surprise. They spoke carefully of taiga watchers, entities that inhabited the deepest forest and observed human intrusion with intelligence that exceeded animal awareness. These beings did not always mean harm, but operated according to rules and motivations that humans could not comprehend. The forest sometimes reclaimed what entered it, and some things were better left unexplored. The clearing where the Petrovs parked their RV remains accessible by the same deteriorating road, though hunters and trappers now avoid the location. The tree stump where Sasha's bear was found eventually rotted and collapsed, but the area still receives occasional visits from relatives who leave flowers and photographs, hoping for closure that has never arrived. The taiga keeps its secrets well, snow melting and falling in endless cycles, covering tracks that lead nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. On October 23, 2022, Daniel Price was driving alone through the Shenandoah Mountains of Virginia on a narrow two-lane road that wound through isolated terrain. The 34-year-old insurance adjuster from Harrisonburg had spent the evening visiting a client near Sperryville and was returning home. The route followed old mountain roads that locals preferred for their scenic value, but tourists often found unsettling after dark. The section Daniel traveled cut through a forest that had stood largely unchanged for centuries. The area's elevation changes created microclimates where fog could form suddenly, particularly during autumn. Wildlife was abundant, including black bears and white-tailed deer. Daniel had been driving for approximately 40 minutes when he checked his dashboard clock, 3:15 in the morning. Fatigue was setting in despite 2 cups of coffee consumed before departure. The road ahead appeared clear, winding through passages created by overhanging tree branches. Without warning, a wall of fog rolled across the road. One moment Daniel could see perhaps 200 feet ahead, and the next his visibility collapsed to barely 10 feet. The fog was dense, almost solid-looking, seeming to absorb his high beams. Daniel immediately reduced his speed from 45 to roughly 15 miles per hour. He considered pulling over, but worried about being rear-ended on the narrow road. He decided to continue at crawling speed. He had been creeping along for perhaps 3 minutes when the road curved gently right. As he rounded the bend, something massive suddenly materialized in his headlight beams, crossing from left to right directly in his path. Daniel's foot slammed the brake pedal. The anti-lock brakes engaged with a rapid, stuttering pulse, but momentum carried his SUV forward. He felt a heavy thud resonate through the vehicle's frame, centered on the front bumper. The SUV rocked violently, as though it had struck something with the density of a boulder rather than yielding flesh. The vehicle stopped, engine still running. Daniel sat frozen, heart hammering. He had definitely hit something large, the impact far too substantial to be a deer or bear. He unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for his flashlight. He stepped out onto the pavement, immediately feeling the fog's dampness. He moved cautiously to the front of his SUV, sweeping the light across the road, expecting to see blood, fur, or evidence of the collision. There was nothing. The pavement was clear. Daniel crouched to examine his front bumper. The chrome grille was bowed inward. The metal creased as though something incredibly solid had compressed it with enormous force. The damage created a concave depression approximately 18 inches wide. The headlight housings remained intact, but the grille looked as though struck by a concrete pillar. Daniel stood, playing his flashlight beam across the road. The fog limited visibility to perhaps 15 feet. He called out, asking if anyone was hurt. No response came except the steady drip of condensation from tree branches. Then he heard it, deep, chest-shaking exhalations coming from somewhere in the fog to his right. The sound was rhythmic and measured, each breath lasting perhaps 3 seconds followed by a 2-second pause. The breathing was too slow for a human, carrying a weight that suggested massive lung capacity. Daniel's flashlight probed toward the sound, but revealed only swirling fog and dark trees beyond the shoulder. He heard branches snapping in sequence, sounds moving away from the road into the forest. Whatever was out there was departing, and based on the spacing of breaking branches, it was moving upright through underbrush that would require a human to crawl through. The sounds continued for perhaps 30 seconds before fading. Daniel retreated to his SUV, climbed inside, and locked the doors. He put the vehicle in drive and pressed the accelerator. The damaged grille created a slight rattling sound. He maintained 20 miles per hour through the fog, which finally began to thin around 340 as the road descended. He drove directly to the Harrisonburg police station and filed a report. The officer examined photographs of the damaged grille and noted it as a possible wildlife collision, though he privately told Daniel the damage looked inconsistent with any animal strike he had seen in 15 years. When the fog lifted at sunrise, Virginia State Police investigators drove to the location Daniel had marked. The road showed no blood, no fur, no skid mark. What they did find, preserved in soft mud beside the road shoulder approximately 20 feet from the estimated impact point, were two enormous barefoot impressions. The prints measured 19.5 inches in length, showing 5 distinct toe impressions with spacing far exceeding human proportions. The depth indicated significant weight. The prints pointed toward dense forest, with no corresponding tracks leading to that location. The photographs were forwarded to the State Wildlife Department. A biologist officially stated that the prints were inconsistent with any known wildlife species in Virginia. Unofficially, he told a colleague the prints resembled gorilla track, but were far too large and appeared where no primate species should exist. Daniel had his SUV repaired at a cost of $1,800, covered by insurance as a collision with an unknown object. The grille was replaced and the bumper reinforcement straightened, but on cold mornings there was a faint creaking sound from the frame that had not been there before, as though metal remembered being compressed by something immovable. He changed his driving route after that night, taking the longer interstate path despite it adding 30 minutes to his commute. When fog rolled through Harrisonburg, Daniel found himself listening for deep breathing sounds outside his windows, and he developed a habit of checking his rearview mirror more frequently, watching for shapes that moved on two legs through spaces where nothing should walk upright.